You can't stand here asking for money in front of God's house. The words landed harder than the cold rain, not because Naomi Reed had never heard them before, but because of where they were spoken, on the wide stone steps of St. Matthew's Church, beneath a white steeple and a bronze cross that caught the last gray light of Sunday morning. Naomi stood still with her shoulders damp and her fingers curled around a weather-softened envelope, the paper bending slightly under her grip. She had been outside for less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes was all it took for people to decide who she was. A gust of wind swept across the parking lot, carrying the smell of wet asphalt, old leaves, and candle wax drifting out each time the church doors opened. Families in pressed coats and polished shoes moved past her in careful little streams. A little boy in a navy blazer stared at her until his mother gently turned his head away. Someone near the railing whispered, "That's so sad." Someone else said, "It's getting worse every year." Naomi lowered her eyes for just a second, not in shame, but to steady herself. Her sneakers were soaked through. The hem of her dark skirt clung to her calves. She looked like exactly what they wanted her to look like. Tired, quiet, and easy to dismiss. Eleanor Whitfield adjusted the pearl clasp at her throat and stepped closer, her heels clicking on the stone with the kind of confidence money taught early. She was one of those women who moved as if every hallway belonged to her before she entered it. "We have a food pantry on Wednesdays," she said, her voice smooth and public, polished for an audience. "If you need assistance, there are proper channels." Naomi looked up at her. The rain had left a fine sheen across the church steps, turning the stained glass reflections near the doorway into broken strips of blue and red. "I'm not here for assistance," she said softly. Her voice barely rose above the wind, but it carried enough for the nearest heads to turn. Eleanor's smile thinned. "Then I suggest you move along before service lets out." Naomi did not move. Her fingers tightened around the envelope instead. On the front, written in careful blue ink now slightly blurred at the edges, were 4 words, "For Pastor Whitmore only." She had read them a dozen times on the bus ride over, though she already knew every curve of the handwriting by heart. Her mother's hand had grown shakier in the last month, but the letters still leaned the same way they always had, gentle, disciplined, full of a dignity the world never seemed willing to reward. Naomi swallowed and glanced toward the tall wooden doors. From inside came the muffled rise of an organ, low and trembling, followed by the distant rustle of a congregation standing. It made something tighten in her chest. She remembered another Sunday, years ago, sitting in the back pew beside her mother while sunlight poured through the glass and painted soft colors on worn hymnals. Back then, Lillian Reed had smelled faintly of starch and lavender soap, her hands rough from work but always warm. "If the church is ever in trouble," she had whispered one night from a hospital bed that hummed beneath fluorescent lights, "promise me you'll go yourself. Promise me you won't mail it. Promise me you'll place it in his hand." Naomi had promised. Now a folded $20 bill fluttered through the rain and landed near her shoe. Someone had dropped it without meeting her eyes. Naomi stared at it for a beat, then bent down, picked it up carefully, and placed it on the stone ledge beside the door instead of in her pocket. That small motion seemed to disturb the air more than if she had shouted. A hush moved through the cluster of people nearest the entrance. Eleanor's face changed, not softened, but sharpened. "Security," she said quietly, without turning her head. Naomi lifted her chin, rain clinging to her lashes, and looked past Eleanor at the dark seam where the church doors met. "Please," she said, calm enough to make the moment feel stranger than it already was. "Just tell Pastor Daniel Whitmore Naomi Reed is here." The security volunteer had just reached the top step when he stopped. Not because Naomi looked dangerous, but because names had a way of changing the temperature of a room, and the one she had spoken seemed to linger in the damp air like the last note of an organ. He was a broad man in a navy blazer with a silver badge pinned to his lapel, the kind of retiree who usually smiled while handing out bulletins. Now his hand hovered near his radio, uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, gentler than Eleanor had been, "I need you to step away from the entrance." Naomi nodded once, as if she had expected that much, but she did not move from the rain-darkened stone. Her eyes stayed on the doors. Eleanor folded her arms tighter across her coat. "This is exactly the problem," she said to no one and everyone. "You let one person linger, and suddenly they think the rules do not apply to them. A few heads turned in quiet agreement. One older man near the column looked away, embarrassed on Naomi's behalf, but he did not speak. No one did. That was what Naomi had learned about public shame. It rarely arrived loud. Most of the time it came dressed as silence. The wind shifted again, colder now, threading through the church courtyard and stirring the bare branches above the memorial garden. Naomi pressed the envelope flatter against her chest to keep the paper from curling. The corner had already softened where rain had seeped in. She thought of the bus transfer tucked in her coat pocket, the $2.13 she had left after fare, the ache in her feet from standing through the long ride across town. None of that mattered. What mattered was the promise. She could still see her mother in that hospital room, the winter light turning everything pale and thin, the television muted in the corner, the plastic cup of melting ice untouched on the tray. Lillian Reed had not asked for much in life. She had never been the kind of woman who believed the world owed her softness. But that last week, with her breath coming shallow and careful, she had reached for Naomi's hand and held it with surprising strength. "You give it to him yourself," she had said. "Not the office. Not a secretary. Him." Naomi had nodded then, just as she nodded now, steadying herself under the stare of strangers who had already written a story about her without asking for a single fact. A young usher in a red tie slipped out one of the side doors with a stack of late bulletins under his arm. Eleanor turned sharply. "Get Pastor Whitmore after him," she said. "Tell him there is a situation outside." The word made several people glance at Naomi again, and something tired moved behind her ribs. A situation. Not a woman. Not a name. Not a daughter keeping a promise. Just a situation on the front steps in wet shoes. The usher started down the walkway, then paused. "Did you say Reed?" he asked, looking straight at Naomi this time. She met his eyes. Naomi Reed. The boy could not have been more than 19, all elbows and nervous shoulders, but the change in his face was immediate. He knew the name, or at least part of it. Before Eleanor could redirect him, he turned and disappeared through the side door at a half-run. The murmur around the steps thinned. It was a small thing, but it cracked the surface of certainty. Eleanor noticed it too. "That does not mean anything," she said, though no one had challenged her. Her voice had lost some of its easy polish. Naomi said nothing. Rain tapped softly against the stone railing. Somewhere inside, the congregation began the final verse, voices rising together through old wood and plaster. Then, just as the last chord rolled through the sanctuary, the main doors opened from within, and Pastor Daniel Whitmore stepped into the gray light, still holding his Bible in one hand. He looked first at Eleanor, then at the security volunteer, and then at Naomi. The moment his eyes found the envelope against her chest, all the color seemed to drain from his face. For a breath, the church steps held perfectly still. Even the rain seemed to soften, as if the morning itself had leaned in to listen. Pastor Daniel Whitmore was still wearing his robe beneath a dark overcoat, the white collar bright against the dim sky, but something in his posture changed the instant he saw Naomi. The hand holding his Bible lowered a fraction. His gaze dropped to the envelope in her arms, then rose slowly to her face, searching it with the kind of careful disbelief reserved for memories that had no business standing in front of you in the present. "Naomi," he said, and her name left his mouth like he had carried it for years without knowing he still remembered how it sounded. Eleanor turned sharply. "Pastor, I was just explaining that she cannot remain on the steps during dismissal." He did not answer her. He took one step forward, then another, his shoes darkening on the wet stone. Naomi felt the eyes of the entire entrance press into her back, but she did not look away. Up close, Pastor Whitmore seemed older than she remembered from the framed church newsletter photos her mother used to keep in a kitchen drawer, older around the eyes, more tired in the shoulders, as if the building behind him had been leaning on him for longer than anyone knew. "I am sorry to come like this," Naomi said. Her voice was steady, though her fingers tightened around the softened paper. "My mother asked me to bring this to you myself." The pastor stopped just in front of her. "Lillian," he said quietly, and this time the name changed the room. Not because everyone knew it, but because he did. The security volunteer straightened. The young usher at the door looked from Naomi to the pastor with open confusion. Eleanor's expression flickered, only for a second, but Naomi saw it. She had expected resistance, judgment, maybe even the easy cruelty of being misread in public. What she had not expected was for her mother's name to move through the air with weight. Pastor Whitmore set his Bible on the stone ledge beside the returned $20 bill. He did it absent-mindedly, as though the habit of being careful had been interrupted by something deeper. "How long has it been?" he asked. Naomi swallowed. 6 weeks. The answer seemed to strike him harder than the cold. His eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, they were bright with something he was trying not to show. Around them, the congregation had gone quiet enough that Naomi could hear the faint hiss of tires on the road below the hill and the drip of rain from the edge of the awning. Eleanor stepped closer, her pearls catching a flash of gray light. "Pastor, perhaps this should be handled privately." He turned then, not sharply, but with enough stillness to silence her. "It should have been handled rightly the first time," he said. No one moved after that. Naomi looked at him, startled not by the words themselves, but by the ache behind them. He turned back to her and reached for the envelope with both hands, the way some people receive communion, careful, almost reverent. The paper was worn thin at the fold. Her mother had sealed it 2 days before she passed, insisting on smoothing the flap herself, though her fingers trembled from exhaustion. Naomi had carried it across bus routes, across sleepless nights, across the hard practical grief of bills and paperwork, and the silence of an apartment that still smelled faintly of lavender soap. Now it rested between them, small and plain and suddenly heavy enough to tilt the whole morning. Pastor Whitmore looked down at the blurred blue ink on the front, traced the letters once with his thumb, and whispered, almost to himself, "She kept her word." Then he lifted his head, looked straight at Naomi in front of everyone gathered there, and said the one thing no one on those steps had expected to hear. "You are not standing where a stranger stands. You are standing where your mother helped keep this church alive." The words did not land all at once. They moved through the gathered crowd in uneven ripples, touching one face, then another, as if people needed time to understand that the woman they had reduced to a problem on the steps had arrived carrying a history older and more faithful than their assumptions. Naomi felt the silence shift around her, no longer dismissive, not yet kind, but uncertain now, and uncertainty was its own kind of crack in a hard room. Pastor Whitmore kept the envelope in his hands as though it contained something breakable. Rain tapped lightly against the brass rail beside them. The returned $20 bill lay under his Bible, pinned by damp leather, forgotten by everyone except Naomi, who noticed small things when the room tried to become large. Eleanor recovered first. She always did. Her chin lifted a fraction, and when she spoke, her tone was lower, tighter, careful not to sound corrected even while being corrected in public. "I am sure we all appreciate service to the church," she said, but no one here knew who she was. Pastor Whitmore turned to her fully this time. There was no anger in his face, which somehow made the moment heavier. "That is exactly the problem," he said. The wind pulled at the hem of his coat. Too many people knew what Lillian Reed did for this church. Not enough ever learned her name. A few older members near the doorway exchanged looks. Naomi saw recognition flicker in places where certainty had been moments before. A woman in a camel coat frowned, as if reaching for a memory just out of reach. An older deacon standing near the handrail lowered his eyes. Pastor Whitmore drew a slow breath and looked back at Naomi, but his words were for everyone. For 18 years, Lillian came before sunrise twice a week, sometimes 3 times in winter. She vacuumed these aisles. She folded bulletins when we were short-handed. She scrubbed wax from candle stands after Christmas Eve services when everyone else had gone home to warm meals and sleeping houses. His voice softened at the edges. More than once, she left groceries on the pantry shelf without putting her name on the donation form. More than once, she repaired what others said was not worth repairing. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She could see it as he spoke. Her mother standing in the fellowship hall under buzzing fluorescent lights with rubber gloves on and a scarf wrapped over her hair. Her mother kneeling beside a leaking baseboard with a rag in one hand and a patient expression on her face, as if even broken things deserved not to be rushed. Lillian had never talked about those mornings like they were noble. She had talked about them the way some people talked about watering a plant or setting a table. It needed doing, so she did it. Eleanor's mouth parted, then closed again. The young usher stared openly now. A little girl from the choir, still in her blue robe under a puffer coat, stepped nearer to her mother and whispered, "Was she the lady who fixed my shoe that one Easter?" Her mother did not answer. Pastor Whitmore seemed to hear anyway. "Yes," he said, still looking at Naomi. "That was her too." Something in the crowd softened after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for Naomi to feel the air change against her skin. No one stepped closer, but no one looked at her like refuse anymore. Pastor Whitmore glanced down at the envelope again, his thumb brushing the damp seam, and grief passed across his face so openly that Naomi almost looked away. "When your mother stopped coming," he said quietly, "I told myself I would call when things settled down here." Then another week passed. Then another. Church work has a way of making a man sound busy to himself. He swallowed, and the church bells above them gave a single low shudder in the wind. "I did not know I was already too late." Naomi held his gaze. "She knew you cared," she said, though her own voice had gone thinner than she wanted. "That is why she still trusted you with this." He nodded once, but the nod carried no comfort. "Only wait." Then, with the congregation still gathered on the wet stone steps and the smell of rain and old wood drifting through the open doors, Pastor Whitmore slid one finger beneath the flap and began to open the envelope Lillian Reed had sealed with the last strength she had left. The paper gave way with a soft tear, the kind of small sound that somehow carried farther than raised voices. Everyone on the steps watched Pastor Whitmore draw the contents out slowly, careful not to bend what the rain had already threatened to ruin. First came a letter folded into thirds, the edges worn white from being handled. Then a cashier's check, clean and official, its surface dry only because Lillian had tucked it inside wax paper before sealing the envelope. Last came a bank notice on stiff cream stock with a red stamp across the top that Naomi recognized immediately because she had seen the same stamp on too many envelopes in the weeks after the funeral. "Past due." Pastor Whitmore stared at the check first, and Naomi saw his fingers go still. He turned it slightly, as if the amount might change in another angle of light, then looked up at her with something close to alarm. Eleanor noticed too. "What is it?" she asked, taking one step nearer. He did not answer. He unfolded the letter instead. The page was lined from an old legal pad, filled in blue ink that dipped and steadied and dipped again, her mother's handwriting fighting its own weakness all the way to the signature. Naomi had never read it. Lillian had not let her. "This one is not for you, baby," she had said from the bed, her voice worn down to almost air. "This one is for a man who needs reminding." Now Pastor Whitmore read the first line silently, and the color in his face shifted again, not drained this time, but struck through, as if grief and embarrassment had met somewhere behind his eyes. Rain gathered at the edge of the awning and fell in steady drops beside the brass rail. A car door slammed in the parking lot below, but no one on the steps turned to look. "Pastor," the security volunteer said, softer now. Pastor Whitmore lifted one hand for silence, though no one had spoken above a whisper. Then he drew in a breath and began to read aloud. "Daniel," he said, and even using the pastor's first name changed the air. "If this reaches your hands, then the Lord chose not to leave me longer, and I suppose I should not argue with his timing now." A faint tremor moved through the crowd. Naomi kept her eyes on the pastor's face, because she could not bear to look anywhere else. He continued, "You once told me St. Matthew's was not brick and stained glass. You said it was whoever still showed up when there was nothing left to gain. I have been thinking about that from my hospital bed, and I wonder if you still believe it now that the notices have started coming." Eleanor's posture changed so slightly most people would have missed it, but Naomi did not. Her shoulders stiffened. The older deacon by the rail looked sharply at the cream bank notice in the pastor's hand. Pastor Whitmore lowered the letter for a moment and glanced at the red stamp, then at the cashier's check again. The congregation began to murmur, not loudly, just enough to sound like wind moving through dry leaves. Naomi understood before he said a word. The church had not just been struggling. It had been closer to the edge than anyone outside the inner offices knew. "Read the rest," someone near the doorway said, and the voice held no authority, only need. Pastor Whitmore swallowed and obeyed. "I know pride can make holy people pretend they are fine while the roof leaks and the pantry shelves thin out. I also know some burdens feel easier to hide when the people carrying them wear collars and smiles." His voice nearly broke on the last word, but he steadied it. "So I am sending what I can. It is not enough to fix every crack, but it may be enough to keep the doors open long enough for decency to remember where it lives. The rain kept falling. No one on those steps looked at Naomi the way they had 10 minutes earlier. They were looking instead at the check in the pastor's hand, and at the truth slowly rising around it, and at the woman in damp shoes who had not come to ask the church for anything at all. Pastor Whitmore lowered the letter only halfway, as if he could not quite separate himself from the hand that had written it. The cashier's check still rested against the page, a hard bright rectangle in the gray morning, and now people could see what had stunned him. The amount was enough to stop the murmurs and thin the air. $8,400. Not a fortune by the standards of the people who sat on boards and spoke easily about capital campaigns, but on those church steps, in the hand of a woman who had arrived in wet shoes on $2 in bus fare, it felt enormous. Naomi watched the number register across face after face. The older deacon removed his glasses and wiped them, then looked again as though disbelief required a second reading. The choir mother in the camel coat pressed her hand to her chest. Eleanor Whitfield did not move at all. That stillness was new on her. Pastor Whitmore looked from the check to Naomi, and his voice came out lower than before. "Naomi," he said, "this is drawn from your mother's account." Naomi nodded. Rain slid from the edge of her coat sleeve onto her knuckles, cold enough to sting. "The account closed after she passed," she said. "The bank issued the check last week." He stared at her a moment longer. Lillian did not have this kind of money. It was not disbelief so much as sorrowful arithmetic, the quiet math of a man who had known exactly how modest her life had been. Naomi glanced at the red-stamped notice still tucked behind the letter. The paper looked ugly against everything else, too official, too sharp, the kind of paper that never apologized for arriving. It was the insurance, she said. A small life insurance policy through the hospital laundry union, and a little from her savings. She had been putting away $20 here, $40 there, for years. Not for herself. She said it was for emergencies and promises. Toward the end, she decided this counted as both. No one on the steps seemed to breathe. Even the security volunteer had lowered his hand from the radio and let it hang useless at his side. Pastor Whitmore looked back at the letter and continued reading, but now each sentence seemed to pull something hidden into the light. "Do not let anyone make a spectacle of this," he read. "I am not sending it to impress people who only learn generosity when it wears a large name. I am sending it because St. Matthew's fed my daughter once when I had nothing in the refrigerator but mustard and 2 tired apples. I am sending it because Grace kept arriving here in small shoes and quiet aprons, and I was lucky enough to witness some of it. If the doors close, let them close honestly. But if there is still a way to keep them open, let pride not be the reason they shut." The words seemed to settle on the wet stone like another layer of rain. Naomi remembered the night her mother had signed the final insurance form at the kitchen table, one lamp on, the apartment dim around them, her breath coming short between sentences. Naomi had argued then, not loudly, but with the stubborn fear of someone who knew what rent cost and what grief left behind. "We might need that money," she had said. Lillian had looked at her with tired eyes and a kind of peace Naomi had not understood at the time. "Baby," she had said, "some people spend their whole lives thinking survival is the only thing worth funding." Naomi had wanted to fight her, but she had seen it then, the quiet certainty in her mother's face. This was not recklessness. It was conviction. Now, on the church steps, with the check glistening in Pastor Whitmore's trembling hand, that certainty rose again, and the crowd finally understood the shape of the truth. Naomi Reed had not come to ask the church to save her. She had come carrying the last thing her mother owned that could save the church. For a long moment, no one seemed to know where to rest their eyes. Some looked at the check, some at Pastor Whitmore, but most of them looked at Naomi, as if the truth had rearranged her features right there in the rain, and they were only now seeing the woman who had been standing in front of them all along. The cold had crept through her coat hours ago, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange on those steps now, stretched thin by embarrassment and revelation. The wet stone beneath her shoes reflected pale strips of color from the stained glass overhead, red and blue trembling near her feet every time the wind shifted. Pastor Whitmore still held the letter and the check like they had weight beyond paper, and Naomi could see the strain in his fingers, the effort it took to carry both gratitude and shame at once. Eleanor Whitfield finally let out a slow breath. "This is generous," she said, and the words sounded careful in her mouth, polished, measured, but not fully sincere. But surely no one expects us to discuss church finances out here in front of everyone. Naomi turned her head slightly. There it was again, that same instinct to move the truth indoors only after it had become inconvenient outdoors. Pastor Whitmore heard it too. No, he said quietly. What no one expected was to mistake the woman carrying our help for someone asking for it. The sentence settled over the steps like another sheet of rain. Eleanor's face held, but not perfectly. A small stiffness appeared around her eyes, the kind that came when a person realized the room had stopped following her lead. The choir mother in the camel coat stepped down one stair, then another, her gloved hands pressed together. Naomi, she said softly, testing the name this time instead of avoiding it. I remember your mother. She used to leave peppermints by the nursery sign-in sheet. Naomi looked at her, surprised by the memory because it was so exact. She bought them at the dollar store, Naomi said. She said children behaved better when adults remembered they were small. A faint, shaky laugh moved through the group, the first human sound of the morning that did not cut. It broke something open. The older deacon cleared his throat and stared out toward the parking lot before speaking. Lillian patched the hem on one of my robes once, he said, almost to himself. Never build the church for it. Another woman nodded. She fixed my daughter's Easter sash with a safety pin and thread. Then the young usher, still standing by the open side door, said, she showed me how to polish brass without scratching it. The memories did not come loudly. They came one by one, soft and late and a little ashamed, like people arriving after they should have been there already. Naomi felt them brush past her, and with each one the morning changed shape. Her mother was no longer a name dragged back from obscurity by a pastor's grief. She was becoming visible in the mouths of people who had once accepted her help as naturally as sunlight through a window, never asking who made certain things remain clean, repaired, stocked, or quietly possible. Pastor Whitmore lowered the letter and looked out at his congregation, his face lined with something deeper than sorrow now. She served this church with more faith than many who had titles here, he said. And her daughter arrived today with the same spirit. Naomi wished, suddenly and fiercely, that her mother could have heard that, not because Lillian had needed praise, but because sometimes the overlooked deserved to know they had not been invisible to heaven just because they had been invisible to people. Rain slid from the church roof in a silver line. The $20 bill remained trapped beneath the pastor's Bible, limp now, almost embarrassed by its own assumption. Naomi saw Eleanor glance at it. Then at the coffee cup someone had left near the steps earlier, the one that had silently accused her before a word was spoken. She stepped forward at last, not with authority this time, but with hesitation so unfamiliar it nearly made her look smaller. Miss Reed, she said, and her voice had lost its public shine. I owe you an apology. The apology hung there for a second, fragile as breath in cold air, and Naomi could tell by the way Eleanor Whitfield held her shoulders that even she did not quite know what to do with the words now that they had finally left her mouth. Rain traced a thin line down the side of the church steps. Somewhere behind them, one of the sanctuary doors shifted on its hinges and let out the faint smell of old hymnals, lemon polish, and wax that had cooled long before dawn. Naomi looked at Eleanor and saw, for the first time that morning, not power exactly, but discomfort stripped of its usual protection. The pearls at Eleanor's throat had gone dull in the rain. Her careful hair had softened at the edges. I spoke to you with judgment, Eleanor said. Quieter now, the sentence shaped without an audience in mind. And I did not ask a single question before deciding who you were. No one interrupted. Pastor Whitmore stood still beside the ledge, one hand resting over the letter, the other over his Bible, as though both scripture and testimony belonged there together. Naomi felt every eye on her again, but this attention was different from the first. It no longer pushed her downward. It waited. That, somehow, was harder. Her fingers were numb from the cold. The rain had crept inside one sleeve and settled against her wrist. She could have answered a dozen ways. She could have let the silence teach Eleanor what public embarrassment felt like when there was nowhere graceful to put your face. She could have repeated every sharp word back to her and dressed truth as revenge. Instead, she looked down at the stone near the door where the paper coffee cup still stood, forgotten and damp, and when she spoke, her voice came out level and tired and honest. My mother used to say people reveal themselves fastest when they think no one important is watching. The words moved through the group without heat, yet several heads lowered all the same. Eleanor's mouth parted, then closed. Pastor Whitmore looked at Naomi with something like sorrow and admiration at once. Naomi lifted her eyes again. But she also said embarrassment is not the same thing as change. The sentence seemed to stop the mourning. Even the little girl in the choir robe, who had been shifting from foot to foot in the cold, went still. Eleanor stared at Naomi, and for a moment the older woman looked as though she had expected anger and had no defense prepared for mercy. "I am sorry," Eleanor said again, this time without polish, without the shelter of distance. "Truly." Naomi held her gaze, then nodded once. Not warmly, not coldly, just enough to acknowledge what had finally been spoken. "Thank you," she said. That was all. No sermon. No humiliation returned. No triumph carved out of someone else's shame. The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle the crowd more than outrage would have. Pastor Whitmore drew in a long breath, the kind a man took when trying to catch up with what Grace had just done in front of him. St. Matthew's has spent too much time speaking about compassion indoors and practicing suspicion on the steps outside, he said. His voice was gentle, but it carried across the stone and into the drizzle and the waiting hush. That ends today. The deacon near the rail nodded slowly. The choir mother wiped at one eye with the back of her glove. Even the security volunteer looked as if he wished he could rewind the morning and choose different footsteps. Naomi should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt suddenly tired in a deeper way, tired down in the bones, where grief and bus rides and unpaid bills and promises kept too long all seemed to settle together. She shifted her weight, and the heel of her shoe made a soft, wet sound against the stone. Pastor Whitmore noticed immediately. "You are freezing," he said. Naomi almost smiled at that, because it was the first practical thing anyone had said to her since she arrived. He turned toward the open church door and then paused, glancing back at the cashier's check in his hand, at the letter, at the faces gathered in wet coats around them. The rain went on tapping its patient rhythm against brass and stone. Then, in a voice lower than before, as though the next truth belonged even deeper than the last, he said, "There is something else everyone here needs to know before any of us step inside." The rain seemed to lean closer when Pastor Whitmore said it, and the congregation, already held in that uneasy hush between shame and gratitude, did not dare break the moment by moving toward the warmth inside. He kept the letter open in one hand and the cashier's check in the other, but now his eyes were no longer on Naomi. They were on the people gathered before him, the people who had sung hymns less than 10 minutes earlier without knowing how close the building behind them had come to silence. "Most of you know we have had repairs," he said. His voice was steady, but it carried the fatigue of a man who had been holding one end of a collapsing truth for too long. "You were told about the boiler, the leak over the education wing, the pantry refrigeration unit that failed in August. What you were not told, because I told myself I could solve it quietly, was that the repairs were only part of it." A faint stirring moved through the crowd. Wet shoes shifted against stone. Someone drew a sharp breath. Pastor Whitmore lifted the cream-colored notice with the red stamp across the top, and even from where Naomi stood, she could feel the paper's bluntness. "St. Matthew's is 10 days away from formal default on its operating loan," he said. The words landed without drama, which made them heavier. "If that happens, the bank has the right to begin proceedings that could close this church before summer." A woman near the handrail put her fingers to her mouth. The older deacon shut his eyes. Eleanor Whitfield went still in a new way now, not offended, not defensive, but exposed. Naomi watched the truth settle across the faces around her and realized many of them were not shocked because they had never imagined trouble. They were shocked because they had been given smaller truths and had mistaken them for the whole thing. Pastor Whitmore looked down at the letter again. "Lillian knew," he said quietly. "Not every number, not every document, but she knew enough. I visited her in February after she missed 2 volunteer mornings in a row. She asked me straight out if we were in danger. I told her we were praying and working through some things. She looked at me for a long time and said, 'That sounds like church language for barely hanging on.'" A few strained smiles appeared and vanished just as quickly. Naomi could hear her mother's voice in the sentence so clearly it made her chest ache. Dry, patient, unwilling to be managed by vague words. I should have told more people then. Pastor Whitmore continued. I should have trusted this congregation with the truth instead of trying to protect everyone from discomfort while the debt kept growing in the dark. His gaze moved across the steps and finally rested on Eleanor. He did not accuse her, but neither did he shelter her. And I should have remembered sooner that appearances can make a church feel stable long after its soul has begun to borrow against tomorrow. Eleanor lowered her eyes. The sentence found its mark. Naomi stood very still, the rain cooling along the back of her neck, and thought of all the Sundays her mother had come home with a tired smile and shoes that smelled faintly of bleach and wet carpet, never once speaking as if service earned a platform. Lillian had understood something this morning had forced into the open. Decay was rarely loud at first. It came quietly, under polished surfaces, under rehearsed kindness, under the assumption that someone else would notice in time. Pastor Whitmore folded the notice back behind the letter and lifted the cashier's check slightly, not as triumph, but as witness. Naomi and her mother did not arrive here to rescue our pride, he said. They arrived to confront our truth. Then he turned toward Naomi again, his face gentler now, though no less burdened. And there is one more truth in this letter, he said. One that makes what she has done even harder to receive. Pastor Whitmore looked down at the page again, and for the first time that morning Naomi saw his composure slip not from surprise, but from the strain of speaking aloud a kindness too costly to be comfortable. The rain had thinned to a fine mist now, more silver than gray, and the stained glass light above the doors had begun to brighten as the clouds shifted east. It painted faint bands of color across the wet steps, across Eleanor Whitfield's shoes, across the cuff of Naomi's coat, as if the church itself had no choice now but to witness what it had nearly turned away. Pastor Whitmore cleared his throat and read from the letter once more. Do not tell Naomi I asked this of her until after it is done, he said, and several people looked at Naomi immediately, startled by the sentence. He kept reading. She has already carried enough of me. She would try to talk me out of it, and she would be right to try. But a mother knows when she is asking for sacrifice and when she is asking for legacy. This is the second thing. Naomi felt the air leave her chest in a slow, stunned pull. Her eyes fixed on the letter in his hand, on the blue ink she knew so well, and suddenly she was no longer standing on church steps in the cold. She was back in the apartment 2 nights before the end, watching her mother rest between shallow breaths while a lamp with a crooked shade cast warm light over unpaid envelopes, prescription bottles, and a bowl of untouched broth gone cool on the table. Lillian had asked for the folder then, the one Naomi thought held hospital forms. She had not known there was a letter inside, much less one written partly around her. Pastor Whitmore continued, and his voice had softened into something almost fatherly, almost ashamed to be the messenger of such devotion. If she brings this to you, it means she honored me even without knowing every burden I had placed in her hands. Tell her I know what I am asking her to lose. Tell her I did not choose the church over my child. I chose the kind of world I prayed might still deserve her kindness. A silence deeper than the earlier hush moved through the congregation. No one shifted now. No one murmured. Even the small child in the choir robe stood motionless beside her mother, her hands clasped under her chin. Naomi stared straight ahead, but her vision had gone soft around the edges. She could not tell whether the wet on her face was rain anymore. Pastor Whitmore lowered the letter slightly, yet his eyes stayed on the page. There is more, he said, though he hardly needed to. The entire morning had become an unfolding of things people thought they could live without knowing. He read on. Naomi wanted to use part of the insurance to move somewhere warmer, somewhere with fewer stairs and better bus lines. She never said that as a complaint, only as a plan. If this check reaches you, then the plan changed because I asked her, with the selfish courage mothers sometimes call faith. The words seemed to strike the crowd harder than the amount on the check had. Not because $8,400 was small, but because now it had shape. It was not spare money. It was not symbolic generosity from a comfortable cushion. It had been a possible apartment with working heat, a deposit, 3 months of breathing room, a life made a little easier for a daughter who had done enough carrying already. Naomi closed her eyes for just a second. She remembered the apartment listings she had saved in a folded coupon envelope, the one near the river bus line with the coin laundry downstairs, the studio farther west with lower rent but cracked tile in the kitchen, the one she almost let herself imagine because the windows faced morning light instead of brick. She had not known her mother had turned those quiet hopes into an offering. When she opened her eyes again, Eleanor Whitfield was staring at her with a look Naomi had never seen on her before. Not pity, something more difficult. The recognition of cost. Pastor Whitmore folded the letter with great care, as though the page itself had earned tenderness, and looked at Naomi over the top of it. His voice, when it came, was low and raw and stripped of every safe church phrase. Your mother did not only give this church her savings, he said. She gave it the future she had hoped you would have. No one spoke after that. The mist had turned so fine it no longer looked like rain at all. Only a pale shimmer drifting through the cold morning air, settling on coats, on eyelashes, on the church steps where too many truths had gathered to be carried lightly. Naomi stood as if the stone beneath her had changed shape. Her mother had known what she was giving. Not only the money, the future attached to it. The small apartment near the bus line. The idea of a space with heat that worked, cabinets that closed all the way, a window where morning light could arrive without asking permission. Naomi had built those hopes quietly, the way people built practical dreams when life had never offered them the luxury of fantasy. Now those same hopes stood in the open between her and the church, and everyone could see the cost of what had been placed in Pastor Whitmore's hand. The pastor looked like a man who wanted to return the check that instant and yet understood that some gifts came wrapped in obedience, and to reject them carelessly was another kind of wound. Eleanor Whitfield stepped out of the stillness first, but there was no sharpness left in her. Her voice, when it came, sounded smaller than Naomi had imagined possible. Then she should not have had to give it, she said. It was not an argument. It was a confession dressed as one. Pastor Whitmore looked at her, then at the congregation, then back at Naomi. No, he said. She should not have. His hand tightened over the letter. And neither should Naomi be left carrying this alone. A murmur moved through the people on the steps, but this time it was different from the earlier whispers. It was not curiosity. It was conscience waking up slowly and realizing the room had already seen too much to go back to comfort. The older deacon reached into his coat pocket first. He pulled out a checkbook with the stiff awkwardness of a man who had spent too long assuming someone else would take care of the practical needs of God. Pastor, he said, clearing his throat, put me down for 1,000. The choir mother in the camel coat looked startled by her own sudden resolve, then opened her handbag. 500 from our family, she said. The security volunteer, still standing at the edge of the steps with rain beating on his blazer, let out a breath and said, I cannot do that much, but I can do 200 today. Another voice came from the back. Then another. Pledges rose in uneven amounts, some large, some modest, all of them sounding more honest for being spoken without performance. Naomi watched it happen with a strange distance, as if she had stepped outside herself and was now observing a room where decency had finally been cornered into action. Eleanor Whitfield did not move at first. Then she removed one leather glove, opened the clasp of her handbag, and took out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she looked up before typing. I have funded the Restoration Committee for 3 years, she said quietly. I sponsored stained glass and a youth banquet and a brass memorial plaque in my husband's name. She paused, and the mist gathered silver in her hair. None of those things kept the doors open. Her gaze met Naomi's and held. I will cover the remaining balance on the operating loan. The words did not ring out dramatically. They fell into the morning with the weight of a stone finally dropped after being carried too long. Several people turned to stare at her, but Eleanor did not seem to notice them. She was looking only at Naomi now, and for once there was nothing polished in her face, only the unbearable clarity of having seen herself and not liked what stood there. Pastor Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were wet. Then St. Matthew's will stand, he said. Naomi felt something loosen inside her, not relief exactly, not yet, but the first soft movement of it. The church might stand, but the future her mother had given away was still a real thing, still missing from Naomi's hands. Pastor Whitmore seemed to understand that before anyone else did, because he stepped down one rain-darkened stair, came closer, and said in a voice only slightly louder than the mist, The check may save this church, Naomi. But what your mother gave up for you will not be lost if I have any right left to call myself your pastor. The words settled into Naomi more slowly than the cold had. She looked at Pastor Whitmore, then at Eleanor Whitfield, then at the faces around her that no longer carried the hard convenience of assumption, and for the first time that morning she did not know what to do with her hands. They felt empty without the envelope, though the check and the letter were still only a few feet away, resting between scripture and rainwater on the stone ledge like two witnesses that had finished speaking and were now waiting to see what kind of people remained in the silence after. Pastor Whitmore stepped down the last stair until he stood level with her on the wet walk. Up close, his overcoat smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of offices lined with books and prayers spoken after everyone else had gone home. He held the cashier's check out, not toward the crowd, not toward Eleanor, but toward Naomi. She did not take it. "Pastor," she said softly, "my mother wanted the church to have it." He nodded, and the grief in his face made him look years older than he had when he first opened the doors. "She wanted the church to live," he said. "And because of what happened here this morning, it will." He glanced back at the congregation, at the deacon holding his open checkbook, at the choir mother wiping her eyes, at Eleanor standing very still with her phone lowered in one hand, as though wealth had suddenly become less useful than humility. "But your mother did not sacrifice your future so we could keep collecting offerings beneath polished ceilings while pretending we had done right by the people on our own steps." Naomi stared at the check. The amount printed across it had once looked like the shape of survival. Then, it had become an offering. Now, in his hand again, it looked like a question she was afraid to answer. "She made her choice," Naomi said, though her voice carried less certainty than the sentence. Pastor Whitmore's expression gentled. "She did," he said, "and now the people she tried to save must decide whether they deserve the gift." The mist drifted through the churchyard in pale threads. Somewhere in the maples at the edge of the lot, a bird shook water from its wings and lifted into the brightening air. Eleanor took a slow step forward. "He is right," she said. No one seemed startled to hear softness from her now because the morning had stripped everyone down to what could still be changed. She looked at Naomi directly. "I cannot undo how I greeted you. I cannot undo the way I saw you before I knew your name. But I can refuse to let your mother's last act become one more way comfort is protected at your expense." Her voice tightened, then steadied. "The operating loan will be paid today. In full. Your mother's check is not needed for that." Naomi felt something rise in her throat, too heavy to be tears and too tender to be called anger. Pastor Whitmore placed the check back into her hands then, closing her fingers around it with both of his. His palms were warm despite the cold. "Let this be what Lillian wanted before fear made her think it had to become something else," he said. "A beginning. Not a rescue. Not charity. A beginning." The older deacon spoke next, surprising himself as much as anyone. "And St. Matthew's can do more than watch her walk away," he said. The choir mother nodded immediately. "We can furnish an apartment." The security volunteer added, "My brother manages rentals on Madison Avenue West. I can call him by noon." Another voice offered utility deposits. Another offered a bus pass. The pledges came differently now, not upward toward a building, but outward toward a person. Naomi stood in the middle of it, stunned by the reversal of direction, by the simple moral force of a crowd finally learning that care had addresses. Pastor Whitmore released her hands, but did not step away. "If you will allow it," he said, his voice quiet enough that people leaned in to hear. "The first thing this church rebuilds after today will not be a roof or a fund or a public reputation. It will be the life your mother hoped you could still have." No one answered right away, not because the offer had been unclear, but because some moments entered the world too cleanly for immediate speech. The mist was lifting now, thinning into pale threads above the churchyard, and the first real sunlight of the morning had begun to move through the stained glass over the entrance, spreading bands of amber, blue, and red across the wet stone steps. Naomi stood inside that light with the cashier's check in her hands, her fingers still curled around the paper Pastor Whitmore had returned to her, and for a second she could almost feel her mother near enough to touch. Not in some grand or theatrical way, just there in the small familiar things. In the smell of lemon polish drifting from the open sanctuary, in the softness of wet wool against her wrists, in the way the morning had finally stopped rushing past her and chosen, at last, to look back. The congregation remained gathered where they were, but the posture had changed. No one stood above her now. No one angled away. The woman in the camel coat came down another step and offered Naomi her umbrella without saying a word. The security volunteer moved the damp paper coffee cup from beside the door and dropped it quietly into the trash. The older deacon tucked his checkbook back into his pocket and bowed his head as if prayer had only just become honest. Eleanor Whitfield removed the other glove from her hand, crossed the distance between herself and Naomi, and stopped close enough for apology to feel human instead of public. "I spent years thinking stewardship meant protecting a building," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of polish, and the rain had softened her hair around her face so thoroughly she no longer looked like a woman made of hard lines. "This morning, I learned how easy it is to defend sacred things while failing the people standing right in front of them." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she gave the smallest nod, not because hurt had vanished, but because truth had arrived, and she was too tired to pretend it had not. Pastor Whitmore drew a slow breath and held the Bible against his chest. "St. Matthew's will remember this day," he said, but his eyes were on Naomi, not the crowd. "Not because we were saved from debt, because we were warned about ourselves." The words settled deep. Naomi looked down at the check one last time, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket, not as hidden money, not as a burden, but as something restored to its proper place. Around her, practical voices had already begun to rise in gentler tones. Someone was calling about an apartment. Someone else was asking about furniture and storage. The choir mother wanted to know whether Naomi preferred a place near the bus route or closer to the grocery store on Fulton. Small questions. Ordinary questions. The kind that built a life more honestly than speeches ever could. Naomi listened to them, stunned by the simplicity of care once it stopped performing and started noticing. Then she turned toward the church doors. Not to enter right away, only to look. The wood was dark with rain, the brass handle bright where 100 hands had polished it over the years. She imagined her mother there before sunrise, keys jingling softly, shoulders tired, still showing up, keeping faith in a place that had not always earned the full tenderness she gave it. Pastor Whitmore stepped beside Naomi, quiet enough not to disturb the moment. "Your mother was right," he said. Naomi glanced at him. "About what?" He looked out over the wet steps, the bowed heads, the brightening morning, and the people who had finally remembered what decency felt like. "That a church is not proven by how beautiful it looks on Sunday," he said. "It is proven by whether mercy recognizes a face before status does." Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. The bells above them began to ring again, low and warm and steady, carrying over the shining pavement and the dripping trees and the parking lot below. She stood there in the colored light, breathing in the scent of rain and old wood and candle wax, while the crowd behind her slowly made room instead of judgment. She had arrived looking like someone they could dismiss. She left them remembering what reverence was supposed to look like. And somewhere in the hush between the bell tones and